Germany is under pressure to supply Ukraine with its most modern battle tanks. What's behind Germany's reluctance? And why are tanks seen as so crucial in the war against Russia? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is nearing its second year, and it's been a return to conventional warfare in Europe, something that would have been unimaginable 12 months ago. While the death toll mounts, the supply of military aid to Kyiv has become an international political battle in itself. Germany is under pressure to allow the supply of its modern Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. The new defence minister gave little away in his first meeting with his US Defence Secretary counterpart, Lloyd Austin.
And as often during history, but especially during these times, Germany and the US are standing together when acting, but also during concrete questions. May it be the tanks, the Patriot air defense, or multiple rocket launchers. German systems are proving itself in Ukraine.
Well, many world political and business figures have been meeting at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where the issue of German tanks for Ukraine has been hotly debated both on stage and on the sidelines. Our diplomatic correspondent James Bays reports on the discussions.
The World Economic Forum at Davos looks at all the issues of the world, but among the EU and NATO leaders here, a lot of the discussions have been about Ukraine, of course, and about weapons for Ukraine. President Zelensky addressed the World Economic Forum by video link. He called for more air defense, more tanks, and the focus has been very much on those tanks and very much on Germany. Germany has a main battle tank called the Leopard 2, but it's not just in German stocks. Germany has sold those tanks to many other EU and NATO countries. Some of those countries, notably Poland, would like to give some of their tanks to Ukraine, but under the export regulations, when Germany sold them, they have to get German permission, and that permission has not come so far. So a great deal of pressure on the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, who was here in Davos. He was asked specifically about the Leopard 2 tanks. He dodged the question. He said that Germany had provided a great deal of weaponry in the first year of this war. He said it would operate in lockstep with its allies, and I think that means very much the United States as well as the other NATO allies. And of course the US hasn't sent its Abrams main battle tank either to Ukraine because it says it would be difficult for the Ukrainians to operate in the terrain that exists on the ground in Ukraine. Chancellor Scholz also saying that he wants to avoid at any cost a full all-out war between NATO and the NATO members and Russia. And so everything now moves, I think, after all the discussions all this week that have been taking place at Davos, to Ramstein, that important meeting at the US Air Base in Germany, where defense ministers will be meeting to decide what now to give to Ukraine.
James Bays with that update from Davos. So let's take a closer look at the specs of the Leopard 2 tank. It's been upgraded several times since it was launched in 1979. Currently, it's used by 13 European armies. The Leopard 2 is valued for its maneuverability. It's lighter than other comparable models. The tank has recent battlefield experience. NATO forces in Afghanistan use them. And Leopard tanks that Germany has supplied to other nations require approval from Berlin before they can be re-exported to a third country. And that means the tanks cannot be sent to Ukraine without Germany's permission. All right, let's bring in our guests now. Joining us live from Wiltshire in the United Kingdom, retired British Major General Arthur Denaro. He's also a former Middle East advisor to the UK Ministry of Defence. From London, Domitilla Sagramoso is a senior lecturer in security and development at King's College London. And from Berlin, I'm pleased to say Ben Aris is joining us, the founder and editor-in-chief of BNE IntelliNews. A warm welcome to you all. General Denaro, if I may start with you, because I just want to examine just why there's such an intense focus on this issue of tanks. One might think that tanks are part of a bygone era, certainly to a layman anyway, because in this age of long-range precision missiles, you'd think that they weren't as potent as they once were. But I presume that's not the case. They're still very valid on the battleground.
Yes, very valid. Please bear in mind that you're listening to a very ancient armchair general, and you need to take that with a pinch of salt. So having tanks on the battlefield contributes to what we call the all-arms battle. It's the integration of that all-arms battle that makes an attacking force or a defending force much more potent. The Ukrainians have got some good tanks, but as we have seen, they're not that much better than the Russians. And we have seen how damaged the Russians' tanks could be with this latest anti-tank weaponry that Ukraine has been supplied with. These modern tanks, particularly the Leopard, the Challenger, and the Abrams, all have very sophisticated protection against most of these modern weaponry. And having them on the battlefield in support of the infantry and under the long-range support of artillery and air is a game changer.
Right, a game changer. In what quantity, General, would they be required to be a game changer, would you say?
Yes, in reference to the very gallant offer of Britain's squadron of tanks, 14 tanks, we have to look at much greater numbers. Way back when we went to rescue Kuwait, to liberate Kuwait from Saddam Hussein's army, we had the Allies had thousands of tanks then. The British had over 150 there. So the offer of 14 is very symbolic, and we were first there doing it, and we hope that this might pull the others in, and I hope it does, because 14 is not enough.
Indeed. And Domitilla, I think I'd be right in saying the tanks would be the most powerful direct weapon provided to Ukraine so far, even though at the moment the numbers fall some way short to what is required, certainly by Ukraine.
Yes, and of course to that we have to add the HIMARS, which have proven very effective as a sort of long-range artillery system. So I think we shouldn't forget about those as well. And what is interesting is how much the HIMARS, really helped to turn the tides in Ukraine's favor. So I think with that, this clearly shows that when tanks or other sort of Western military equipment is delivered to Ukraine, it can really have an impact on the battlefield. That's why the delivery of these tanks is so relevant. And I would agree with the previous speaker that it really would help to sort of assist Ukraine in trying to sort of carry out more effective offensive operations and also be able to operate more effectively in defensive positions as a kind of also some kind of mobile artillery force. And at the moment, I think this is very important, and that it also comes together with additional artillery ammunition and also possibly, fighter jets, so that the whole combination of armed forces can operate in a more effective offensive manner.
Right, and Ben Aris, what about the Russian capability? What would it mean for the Russian side of things if, large convoys of tanks joined a Ukrainian offensive? How would it change things, do you think?
I think it would be significant, as the general said, if enough tanks were sent in number to the battlefield. I mean, you have to put this into the context. Why is this coming up now? And the battle now has sort of ground down to a stalemate. I mean, in September, we had this remarkable counteroffensive by the Ukrainians in the Kharkiv region, and they broke through the Russian defenses and then went like a knife through butter, pushing them back, liberating hundreds of kilometers. And then shortly at the end of that month, they recaptured Kherson as well. But now the fighting has come down. The Russians have done their partial mobilization. They've brought 300,000 fresh troops into the field, and the front line has stabilized. And the epicenter of the fighting now is around Bakhmut in the Donbass region, and Soledar, which apparently has just fallen to the Russian side. But that fight at Bakhmut has been going on for months, and we're talking a couple of meters a day, if that, and it goes backwards and forwards. And so the two sides are now butting heads, but nobody has the advantage. If you were to bring in these powerful tanks, these offensive weapons, then that would make a huge difference if you bring them in enough number, because then you can smash through you can go on the offensive and attack the Russian defenses and push them back. Poland, President Duda Davos yesterday called on the West to send 100 of these Leopard 2s. And I think there are around 2,000 of them scattered throughout Europe. And Poland itself has about 250. And 100 Leopards on the field would make all the difference because, again, as the general said, that they're about 20 tons heavier than anything the Russians have got, the T-72s, which is the workhorse of the Russian side. And the armor on them is significant. And Russia doesn't have things like the American-made javelins that the Ukrainians had in order to take these tanks out, so that they would be a real game changer. And I think that's what people are looking at, is like they're getting frustrated at this deadlock. 100,000 people have died on both sides with no one making any progress. And so the Ukrainians are saying, right, enough with the defensive weapons, with the Patriots, with the javelins that you sent us. These have been very useful. Give us some offensive weapons so that we can actually win this war and push the Russians back over the 1991 borders.
Okay, and General, so Ben alluded to it just then, but any big-scale offensive would need, by Ukraine, that is, would need to be backed up by air and ground support, right?
Yes, that. And of course, the tank gives the ground forces maneuverability, which, as Ben's just told us, has ground to a halt. In order to maneuver, we've got to have mobile, well-protected, hard-hitting firepower, and the only thing that can deliver that is the tank, and the Leopard is perfectly formed for that one, and of course it's handy by, so it's not going to take long to get it into Ukraine, and it is relatively easy to operate compared to some aspects, certainly of Abrams and of our Challenger. But it's the maneuverability and the protection that affords this very hard-hitting bit of kit that makes it such a potent force.
All right, so that's the kind of the battlefield landscape. Domitilla, why do you think Germany has been just so reticent, so reluctant in committing to providing these German-made tanks?
Well, first of all, it's important to know that the reluctance has come primarily from the Chancellor Olaf Scholz. I think he and others in his party are very worried about an escalation, about a potential conflict between Russia and NATO, and Germany being involved in that. And now I think a bit exaggerated because, Germany could even start by authorizing the delivery of these Leopards by those countries which have them already, and that wouldn't necessarily involve Germany itself. There is a lot of concern in Germany of being seen, in certain quarters as being seen as being sort of part of a so-called offensive. But I think that is really the wrong approach. But there is, I think, a very strong, in a way, sort of pacifist tradition in Germany. And what is interesting is that Olaf Scholz, in his youth, really was part of this pacifist tradition. And he was sort of very much a sort of anti-NATO politician, although, he evolved a lot throughout his political career. And as we know, he gave his famous speech at the start of the war in Ukraine, where he talked about, how Germany had to change its course and rearm again in the face of the Russian threat. But at the same time, I think there is a very strong reluctance, and I think he's probably looking at public opinion, which is slowly shifting, and there is increasing support for so-called freeing the Leopards. But I think that, deep inside, I think he's very reluctant to see Germany because of its history during the Second World War and also during the Cold War, when Germany was occupied by the Soviet Union, and Germany could be a potential theater of war, that this can repeat itself. So there is a very sort of ingrained, deep historical sort of narrative that is strong in certain quarters in Germany that in a way is putting a brake. But I think that he's, the Chancellor is increasingly under pressure from inside his own coalition by members of the Green Party and the FDP.
Yeah, let me just bring Ben in there. There are some contradictions here, aren't there? Because you have this German reluctance, but on the other hand, back in February last year, Olaf Scholz was announcing this historical turning point for Germany to ramp up its defensives, which many said that was, something extraordinary since they haven't done that since World War II. And even today, we're hearing about the new German defense minister talking up Germany's need to strengthen defenses.
Yeah, but the key word there is defense. And what we're talking about here is a war with Russia, which is, the tanks are offensive weapons. And look, to step back and understand the context of this and why, as Donatella said, of course, Germany has this history. It almost uniquely in Europe, has fought the Russians and lost and doesn't want to repeat that experience. They're more sensitive than anybody else. But the overriding goal of NATO in general, and Germany in particular, is not to help the Ukrainians beat the Russians, first and foremost. It's first and foremost is to prevent a world war, to prevent a direct conflict between NATO and Russia. No one wants to go there. And that's one of the reasons why we've been pouring in defensive weapons in order to make sure that Ukraine doesn't lose this war, which is not quite the same thing as making sure it wins this war. And we've now reached the point with the stalemate where everyone is getting frustrated and hundreds of thousands of people are dying. So there's now a push to abandon that and to give Ukraine some offensive weapons to actually change the balance. And the reason why Germany in particular is so nervous, because it's unpredictable how the Kremlin will react. So far, Putin's indicated that he hasn't got a problem with NATO supplying defensive weapons, in so much as that Russia still has the advantage on the field, both in terms of artillery and men, and that he can just grind the Ukrainians down. And if you put offensive weapons that change the tide of the war into Ukraine's advantage, then all the new really scary possibilities, including tactical nuclear weapons, appear. And that's really what's behind this hesitancy. And it's not just Germany. Jens Stoltenberg from NATO said right at the beginning of this conflict, our top priority is to avoid World War III. Our second priority is to help Ukraine defend itself. And it's doing an amazing job, something that nobody was expecting.
Right. General Denaro, do you concur with that? Or, there is the other argument that defeat for Ukraine, that in itself could lead to World War III.
Yes, it could. And it's incredibly difficult to predict which way it's going to fall and whether the supply of these tanks, which are in the main aim offensive, but also are hugely useful in any form of defensive posture, is going to affect that balance. And I'm finding it very difficult to predict that.
And so, Ben, we talked about the United States there, and Germany themselves have said that the US haven't sent any tanks, and if they do, then we will. Why do you think the US is reticent as well?
It's the same fears. Nobody wants to start Third World War with Russia, because then it all becomes extremely unpredictable and becomes extremely scary with the nuclear exchange between the major powers. And the Americans too have also followed this policy of supplying largely defensive weapons. The peer pressure amongst the Europeans, and you've got some countries in Europe like the Polish and the Baltic states in particular, that are very anti-Russian, very pro-Ukraine, want to see these heavy weapons put in. And others sitting on the fence, and people like Hungary, of course, are friends with Putin. But for the Americans, Schultz is trying to pass the buck. He's getting a lot of pressure from all the other EU members, particularly the more aggressive ones, to send these tanks. And Germany has the largest defense sector in Europe, and so everybody's got German weapons, and you can't export them to Ukraine without German permission. And Schultz said this week, I think it was just yesterday, that if the Americans send the Abraham tanks, their tanks, then Germany will follow suit. And so he's passing the buck to the Americans. But then the Americans have said, and I think your reporter said that they're reluctant to send their tanks too, because they're not suitable in the terrain. We're talking about huge flat agricultural land. This is like the perfect terrain for tanks, and ideal, and moreover necessary, because there's so little cover. So it sounds a bit like an excuse. And again, on the English side, the UK side rather, They've sent 14 tanks, which is a gesture. Like the general said, you have to send much more. 50, 100 tanks would make a difference. So we're not seeing that too. So everyone's pulling their punches. I think at Ramstein tomorrow, what we'll see is that Scholz will cave to the pressure that he's under, but there'll be a token gesture of a dozen Leopards that will be sent from Poland, say, in order to take the pressure off, to do something more to help the Ukrainians. But again, not going far enough, not sending a battalion of like 100 tanks that would actually make a big difference on the battlefield because of the fear of provoking Russia to go to the next level, doing mass mobilization, putting 1 million people into the field and overrunning Ukraine, and then start taking out ammo dumps in Poland or really extreme reactions like that.
And Domitilla, just coming back to this point about a potential Russian defeat, especially in the light of what the former Russian president, Dmitry Medvedev, has said, that the defeat of a nuclear power in a conventional war may trigger a nuclear war.
Well, I think that they've been threatening the use of nuclear war now for several months. Even before the start of the war, Putin was talking about this risk if there was an attempt on Crimea by the Ukrainians. I think that, we have to take that into consideration, but it shouldn't be a sort of a self-deterrent. I think that we have to be cautious, but I think that it would be highly unlikely that Russia sort of starts a major nuclear exchange with the West. I mean, there is a possibility they could use, of course, tactical nuclear weapons, but what would they really achieve? And I think that the Americans have made it clear that if there is a use of tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, the Americans and NATO would intervene, even with conventional forces, and there would be a very high risk to the regime of President Putin. So I think that often many of these statements are empty threats, but they have to be taken seriously. And as the previous speakers noted, the question of escalation is in everyone's mind. So, there is caution, but at the same time, we now have to consider that we are at this sort of turning point because Russia is ready to mobilize a very high number of soldiers. It is engaging its entire sort of economic infrastructure and industrial infrastructure towards the war effort, the production of tanks, and other kinds of military equipment that could be potentially useful very much to Russia on the battlefield.
Okay, we're just running out of time. I just want to finally come to General Denaro. Sending all these munitions to Ukraine, it crosses my mind that it's not just depleting countries of their own defense capability, and doesn't it make the world a more dangerous place in that sense too?
I don't think so. What I think really is important here is a speed of decision making, because there's no doubt that to change the whole tempo of this conflict and to get it resolved, we need to support the Ukrainians with tanks. And the Americans can send theirs in smaller numbers because clearly the distances, and also the training on the Abrams is more difficult. The British have already planned to send a squadron, and the real answer is for the Leopards to be supplied by the various countries who've got them, because they're there on the borders, ready to go, and they are much easier really to operate.
All right, we'll watch closely how this pans out in the coming days. We have to leave it there. Thank you to all our guests, Arthur Denaro, Domitilla Sagramoso, and Ben Aris. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nick Clark, and the whole team here, it's goodbye.